The Romantic period was a time of great expansion in music, and one of the things that was very important is the composers and the performers of Romantic music. Until this time, the greatest celebrity would be to the composer, but it was during this time that not only composers but performers became celebrities. One person I'd like to mention is someone you may have never heard of. His name was Niccolo Paganini, and Paganini was a virtuoso violinist. Not only was he great in his own right, but he impacted many, many other composers that we'll talk about. He's a great influence on Franz Liszt, Frederick Chopin, Robert Schumann, Clara Wieck, and many other composers were influenced by Paganini. Now Paganini, he was definitely a star. He would show up at his concerts wearing all black, riding in a black chariot, pulled by black horses and escorted by 2 black wolves. When he would get on stage, he was such a show-off that he would a violin has 4 strings, and sometimes he would cut one of the strings so that he knew it would break, and in the middle of a performance he would be playing and all of a sudden that string would break and he would continue the piece on only 3 strings. So he was a real showman. There was a young man named Franz Liszt who was a very good pianist, and when he heard Paganini play the violin, he committed himself to becoming the Paganini of the piano, and he indeed did become a tremendous pianist. Franz Liszt, we'll talk about him later. Well, let's talk about some of the famous composers. We truthfully have to begin with Beethoven. He is the greatest composer of both the classic and the Romantic period, yet he doesn't fit completely in either period. But much of what other composers and performers accomplished was because of things that Beethoven started. Beethoven, following Mozart, Beethoven brought the piano into prominence. Some of the other composers, though, Franz Schubert, he was a German composer, greatly influenced by Beethoven, but he wrote over 900 songs. Now, the whole genre of a song, and by that I mean one person singing and someone else on the piano playing, or perhaps even an orchestra, but the idea of a solo song was very strong during the Romantic period, and Franz Schubert was known for many, many songs. Hector Berlioz, he composed primarily symphonies, and he was a great friend with Paganini and was influenced greatly by him. He was a French composer, and one of his symphonies called Symphonie Fantastique, or Fantastical Symphony, in that symphony he invented something called the idea fixe. Sorry, I lost it there for a minute. But the idea fixe is the idea of there was a certain character, and every time that character would come on stage, you would hear this music in the background. And that is, of course, carried out in many of the movies that we hear today. If you've ever seen Star Wars, you will hear the same theme come up every time Darth Vader enters the room or is even nearby. The idea fixe. Felix Mendelssohn, he was a Jewish German composer. He was remembered for several things, but one of the things we have to thank him greatly for, he was a conductor along with being a composer, and the works of J.S. Bach had been pretty much largely forgotten in the 100 years. He died in 1750, and so now we're here in the 1800s, and a lot of his music had been forgotten, and Felix Mendelssohn put together a performance of St. Matthew's Passion, and when people heard it, it was so well received that it caused a whole revival in the music of J.S. Bach, much of which perhaps would have been lost if it weren't for the work of Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn had a sister named Fanny Mendelssohn. She married Mr. Hensel, so her Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel. She was a great composer too, but because she was a woman, many of her works during that time, women were not considered to be great composers, and so some of her works were published under her brother's name. A great pianist of the era, Frederick Chopin. Now, if you're reading the text, it looks like Chopin, but it's a French name, and so it's pronounced Chopin. Frederick Chopin. He was a piano virtuoso, and he again, when he was 19, he heard the great violinist Paganini play, and he was inspired to become a great pianist as Paganini was the violinist. And also Paganini was making his living touring the country and as a performer, and Chopin did the very same with the piano. He was a Polish nationality, and even when he moved to France, he did still write a lot of music based on Polish folk songs and folk dances. Oddly enough, he wrote no program music, and when almost everyone else was writing almost exclusively program music, Chopin wrote music for the piano, and it was simply for the piano. It was not program music most of the time. Robert Schumann, a great pianist, again influenced by Paganini. You'll study him. Clara Schumann, originally Clara Wieck until she married Robert Schumann, a great pianist as well. Franz Liszt, we already mentioned as a great pianist, but he was also a great composer and of both piano music and symphonic poems. Opera. Now, opera was larger than it had ever been. Operas were often 3 and 4 hours long. There were many great opera composers during that period, but especially you want to learn about Giuseppe Verdi, the greatest composer of Italian opera, and then he was followed later by Puccini. And then in the German opera, you'll study Richard Wagner. Again, his name looks like Wagner, but it's pronounced Wagner. Richard Wagner. He wrote Lohengrin, Tristan and Isolde, the Meistersingers of Nuremberg, many great operas. His music was sometimes well received and sometimes not. One of the things that he invented was the music drama. Now, this should sound familiar to you, even if you're not an opera buff. See, that one of the music dramas that he wrote, it took him 35 years to write it. It was The Ring of Nibelungs, and it was actually 4 long operas that each stood on their own, but they were based on a single medieval German legend involving gods and goddesses, dwarfs and giants and human heroes. The central symbol in the entire cycle was a magic ring made of stolen gold that dooms all who possessed it. Sounds a little bit like Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? Then there were great nationalist composers. Mussorgsky from Russia, Smetana from Bohemia, and Dvorak also from Bohemia, Jan Sibelius from Finland, and Saint-Saëns from France. You will enjoy listening to their music. It's very, very beautiful. Then Peter Tchaikovsky. You probably know him from the Nutcracker, but he also wrote Symphony Pathétique and also the 1812 Overture. You'll study Johannes Brahms. Great songs, great orchestra, and especially probably remembered for his Brahms Lullaby. And then the last great composer of the Romantic period was Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler began his career in Bohemia. He was a great conductor. He eventually moved to New York in the United States and became the director of the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera. All of these composers, enjoy reading them, listen to their music, read the stories about their life. They were great composers, and we are very privileged to have their music. Thank you.